we spoke. So the focus of our project is to capture both the gradual and abrupt changes in rangeland condition over the Landsat time series. So that's primarily from 1985 until present, and with that also capturing interannual variation related to weather. Here's the list of the components that we make: bare ground, litter, herbaceous, shrub, sage, and, pardon the sloppiness here, new to this generation, tree and shrub height. All of this is based on direct observation on the ground, um, where we looked at high resolution images, so like 2 meter resolution images, collecting field observation over those imagery, using machine learning to scale up the field data, and then pulling in Landsat data, other variables, topography, elevation, obviously the Landsat data itself, to produce the time series maps. We're also using all the BLM AIM data as well as training. So the flagship product that we produce is this time series cover map for those 10 components I mentioned before. These are going to be fractional cover for each of those components. So 0 to 10 or 0 to 100% cover for all of those components, and a unique map for every year from 85 through 2023 in our newest iteration. We take those data and run trend statistics on them as well, of a couple different flavors of trends, both linear change metrics and what we call structural change. So these would be like significant break events in the time series where something significantly changed in the time series. Then we'd use the time series cover maps to predict out future cover projections as well, using a couple different climate change scenarios. Okay, so here's a list of some of the updates from when we last spoke. We've reworked all of our high resolution training data, which is the overwhelming majority of where our model gets its information, using improved machine learning methodology, generated new Landsat composites, focusing on capturing the dynamic range of variation within a year. So for us to separate things like annual herbaceous from perennial herbaceous, it's important to get sort of the extremes of what Landsat was seeing throughout the course of each year. And finally, we've expanded into a portion of southern Canada to include all of the sagebrush biome. Just a little background on the worldview imagery. So this is our source of most of our training data. This is an example of what one of those images would look like, where we would go out and collect field plots. And then here's an example of one of our old predictions of shrub cover at that high resolution scale. Tried a couple different methods and arrived on this DNN, which is a digital neural network, as the best. And spare me any too technical questions on machine learning. I'm an ecologist. I use machine learning as a tool. So some of the nitty gritty questions on machine learning things, I'd have to pass on to the rest of the project. The point here is that moving to this more modern machine learning approach improves our training accuracy, significantly so. Another thing we did was pull in texture information. So typically what we've done in the past is just associate the training data, say a pixel is tagged as 10% shrub cover, with the spectral information of that exact pixel. But what we've also found is that the information from the neighboring pixels is important to better differentiate. So it allows us to see like how variable the local landscape is, which turns out to be highly related to things like shrub cover and tree cover. Here's an overview of all the training data that we pulled into our current iteration of products. So pretty extensive. This is our current study area boundary. I mentioned we have a little chunk now into Canada as well. I would like to expand further east into the Great Plains at some point. That might be outside of your area of interest, but we've been limited in doing that, being that this project is primarily funded from the BLM. The geography we're mapping is the geographies that they mostly care about. So all told, with all of our high resolution training sites, these are those black points you're seeing here, all the AIM data from BLM, in addition to the LMF data, pulling in data from Landfire as well. We've got a substantial number, nearly 65 million training points to pull from. Might be going into the weeds a little bit too much for this group, but just to underscore that point I made before about capturing the range of conditions within the course of a year to better improve predictions. This is an example of one of our new Landsat composites relative to one of our old Landsat composites that we had used previously. So you can see it. The old one has more artifacts, less variation. These things cause mostly cosmetic problems in the data, but what we've seen is when we have cosmetic problems in the data, that does reduce user confidence. The point here is that our new Landsat compositing approach does a better job of accentuating the range of conditions from across each year. I'm going to skip over this one. All right. So here's an overview of the 30,000 foot view of what our new generation of components look like. I mean, there's a lot to dig into here. In general, I think the spatial patterns make sense relative to my experience in the field. You know, I like to pick on annular herbaceous a lot. There's clearly a lot going on in the Snake River Plain sort of area in Idaho up into Oregon. But then tons of annular herbaceous in California as well. Some creeping into the Great Plains as well at this point. And by the way, feel free to interrupt me with questions at any point during this presentation. Shrub height is a new one that we produce this time. We work closely with the group who does sage-grouse habitat modeling. And shrub height turns out to be a really important factor for nest selection for sage-grouse, which is why we ended up producing this layer. So the static map is interesting, but to me what's really a lot more interesting is looking at how things have changed through time. So this is just a simple linear trend of each one of the components from 85 through 23. So where we have blue, we're in or decreasing cover of that component on average through time, and red, we're seeing increase in that component through time. So some of the big things we see is decreasing bare ground over a lot of the north, especially into like Montana and Wyoming, and you can see those same areas show up as increasing herbaceous cover. But unfortunately, a lot of that increase in herbaceous cover is coming from annuals. So to say that this is good news is maybe a bit of a stretch. The other thing going on is that there's a long-term trend of increasing precip over a lot of the northern Great Plains. What else should I point out? Fire is a major driver here clearly as well. I mean, we can see where we've got a lot of fire going on in the northern Great Basin. Shrub cover is trending downward. In the same areas, we'd see an increase in herbaceous cover. Tree cover is increasing overall, except in the areas where we've had major fires, in central Idaho, for instance, over into California as well. This new generation of products does a better job of detecting the pinyon juniper encroachment issue into some areas of the Great Basin. Um, Definitely better results overall in terms of this new generation of products. Okay, so here's a comparison, just for example, our old generation on the left versus our new generation on the right. Um, I'll pick on Nevada here. So in our old generation, we showed sort of marginal increases in tree cover, and by the way, the old generation was 85 through 21. So it's not a quite apples to apples comparison because we've got 2 additional years in our new generation, but mostly equivalent. Um, so with our improved methods, we're, I think, more accurately depicting the increase in tree cover over that portion in central Nevada. I think these are maybe an even more compelling way of conveying the same information. So here, what I'm doing is condensing the trends we've seen in the previous slides to level 3 ecoregion averages. Same kind of color ramp, increase in red, decrease in blue. So we can focus on the ecoregions where we're seeing increase in, for example, annular basis. In our new generation of components on the top tier here, we see, I think, more accurate in terms of increasing trends in annular basis, especially in the Great Basin and then over into the Great Plains as well. Shrub cover patterns are pretty similar between the two products, but um, you know, typically these shrub cover decreases are driven by fire, except in Wyoming. And a part of northern Montana, shrub cover is increasing. There's not a whole lot of fire in these areas, which I think is why shrub cover is increasing. And the same thing with tree cover. One of the major stories that I've been reading about is the increase in tree cover across the Great Plains, and that does extend over into our study area a bit in this part of the world, in the Dakotas, in Wyoming and Montana as well, and then into the Great Basin as well, as I've mentioned before. Oh, apologize, that's about the same. Okay, so this is a more tabular way of looking at the data. Just the overall trends across the entire West. Um, Average across, all the entire study area. So annular basis clearly is going up. That's one of the biggest stories going on. And somewhat counterintuitively, at least it was counterintuitive to me initially, is that increasing annular basis drives decreased bare ground. Annular basis cheatgrass is filling in spaces between shrubs, and it produces a lot of litter as well. So we can see litter is increasing as well on average. So these two are strongly related, as is the decrease in shrub cover, slight increase in tree cover overall as well. And one thing I want to highlight here on the bottom, so I'm plotting the trends in annular basis in both burned and unburned areas. That's been a topic in the literature recently. So what we see here is that there's this concept that cheatgrass needs fire to expand, which has been challenged recently in the literature. Uh, and what we're seeing in our data is agreeing with that challenge, in that annular basis is still increasing even in areas that never burned at all since 1985, and it's increasing at a far greater rate, in burned areas, which not terribly surprising. What I hope to see in these sort of data is unsurprising results. I want to see stuff that corresponds with what we would expect from the literature, and I think overall that's what we're seeing. Sagebrush is declining as well. I mean, that's no terrible surprise here. one thing is the ranges on the y-axis are pretty small just because we're averaging over a huge area. Any any questions before I move into some more specific case studies?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, my phone is just making all sorts of noise. Um, I just want to make sure I'm understanding your definition. So bare ground, when all these ground surveys are done, they're highlighting where they're seeing just dirt. And so it may just be a timing thing. So you're seeing you have bare ground increasing and annual herbaceous increasing. And I'm just reading that as there's more space between shrubs, and then over time annuals take over. And that's, you're sort of affirming that concept. Am I
Yes,
missing
yes,
something? Okay.
yes. So what we call bare ground is any exposed mineral, soil, or rock or sand, anything like this, right? Um, Anything that doesn't have some sort of plant material, dead or alive, covering it would be called bare ground.
And then I don't want to dominate here. Can I ask one more?
That's fine.
I just want to make sure that I think I missed something really obvious. I understand generally what you've done here, but when you're going back, I understand how you're taking the data from today and doing the computer modeling and the computer learning. But as you're going back to 1985, are you somehow taking it backwards then through
Okay,
that
so
learning process, or are you actually looking at data from those years as well?
that's a really good question, and one that I kind of glossed over. So you didn't miss it, I didn't say
Okay.
it. Um, so what we do, we've got training data from across both space and time. Some of our training data is from as early as 1985, some as late as 2023. So what the key is to associate the correct year of training data with the correct year of Landsat imagery. And you mix and match those observations through space and time and build out a model that doesn't know time per se. It is ambiguous to time. And then that model can be applied equally to each and every year of Landsat observations. That's how we can look backwards in time as we do. Does
And
that
so
help?
it does. And so I know we have a lot more data since the AIM program and other programs, so they're getting you actual ground observations. So then is the accuracy of 20, 30 years ago more suspect, we presume, just because there's a lot less ground observation to train it?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the point is that as long as you have the correct relationship between the right year of training data and the right year of satellite observation,
Okay.
and develop a relationship there, that can be applied to any year of of Landsat imagery going forward or backwards in time. And we've tested things like this, like withholding new data, like anything from 2010 onwards or anything from 2010 prior. And it's really fairly insensitive to time. Um, Space is more important than time in terms of training, and we've got space covered pretty well. I wish we had more data earlier in the time series. Of course, if I had a time machine, we would have thousands of AIM points from the 1980s, but that's not not possible. Uh, but to be clear, most of our training data is coming from in-house, from these high-resolution images that we trained. AIM is sort of icing on the cake, to be quite honest, relative to that. What AIM does for us is excuse me, fill in some of the spatial gaps between our training sites. Any other questions?
I have a question. So how large of a parcel of land would we have to look at or examine in person in order to find the same kind of conditions that you're seeing with your technique?
That's
Can
a
we look
real
at 10 acres, 5 acres, 100 acres? What would we need to really be able to correlate that with on the ground visions?
that's a really good question. I mean, I'll just cut to the chase and I've got a slide on that exact topic. Um, that's a question. Probably the most common question I get from users is exactly that. Um, and theoretically, the data should be accurate to a single pixel. But I would also say that if you have the potential of looking at a broader scale, you're going to see accuracy increase. Um, I would use the analogy of, if you're trying to characterize a 10,000 acre pasture, you wouldn't use a single field observation to do that. That would be unfair to do so. It would be a poor characterization of the variability in that pasture. The more observations you get from the field within that pasture, the more representative you are. And that same kind of concept holds with remote sensing data as well. So I've done a little bit of analysis on this. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. Uh, the take home of the analysis I did is that if you can scale the data from 30 meters, which is the native resolution, to 90 meters, for example, you're going to see reduced error in whatever analysis you do. So, like something like a 10% reduction in error by scaling from 30 meters to 90 meters. And I think for a lot of the questions that we are trying to answer in rangelands, 90-meter scale would be more than sufficient to answer those questions. So the point here is that error does reduce as you look at a bigger and bigger window. You consider more and more pixels of information, because there are oddball pixels, there are weird results here and there, and as you average more, as you get a more complete census of what's going on, you're going to get more accurate results. And I wish I could give you more hard and fast guidance than that, but there is no black and white line in the sand on this. Besides, the coarser you look at it, the better. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Matt, just to follow up on that. So when you say 90 meters, what does that translate to into hectares or acres, or, how am I? Is that, and then Laura Welp also has a question. I see she's got her
I'm
hand.
not okay. I can't translate to hectares, but I can tell you a Landsat pixel is as big as a baseball infield. So 9 of those would be 90-meter resolution. So baseball infield is 30 meters by 30 meters approximately. If you can envision that scale in your head, I don't know, 90 meters would probably be 2-3 acres, something like this. I don't know the exact number, but the point is you're smoothing out some of the spatial variability and also some of the error in looking at broader scales.
That makes sense to me. And I know Laura has a question.
Okay.
One pixel is about a quarter acre.
Okay.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I was just struck by something that I noticed you said a couple slides ago where bare ground is defined as anything that does not have vegetation on it, living or dead. So that means like rock, for example,
Yes.
could be the same as soil, which to me ecologically is, they can be very different, since when I think of bare ground, I think my mind immediately goes to potential for wind or water erosion, and
Right.
potential for facilitation of cheatgrass or some other bad thing. Also
Right.
potentially good things, I suppose. But so bare ground dirt, I should say, bare dirt is different ecologically from rock. And I'm just wondering how that has anything to do. Oh, and Mike says, how does biological soil crust fit in? That's a good question too. Yeah, is that soil, bare soil?
You guys are asking all the hard questions, and that's great. Um, okay, so yes, I agree. From a hydrologic or ecological perspective, bare soil would function differently than rock would. The trouble is that separating those things from a remote sensing perspective, good luck. That's what I'm going to say. Some of these components are driven by just the pure feasibility of separating these things with the Landsat spectral characteristics. We are, I believe, pushing the limits of what can be done with Landsat, even doing these components. Could we separate bare ground, like bare soil, from rock? Possibly, but it's not going to be as accurate. So there's trade-offs there. The more you split, the lower your accuracy is. And then the same thing. Okay, so the biological soil crust. We thought about that for a long time. Where do we where do we put that? We ended up with litter. Is that ideal? No. But we also tried producing a unique map of biological soil crust, and that's highly prone to error. So at this point, I don't think it's possible to use Landsat to separate out biological soil crust from, say, bare ground cover or even some sorts of herbaceous cover. Um, there's a amount of lumping and splitting we have to do just to make this work. Any other questions?
Just one, this is Gary. I was wondering on some of your training data, you go back to 1985. Is that the beginning of the Landsat? I thought Landsat was prior to that. And have you looked at data like BLM's FIM data, which goes back to the late 70s, and trying to correlate that with your with any Landsat or other?
Right. Yeah, so you're right. There is Landsat data prior to 1985. The trouble is it's from a different type of sensor, and it's not compatible with Landsat data from 85 onwards. And the incompatibility is relatively subtle, but for the purposes of tracking this level of subtlety in components, it's going to cause a major problem. I would love to extend the record earlier in time. I think there is Landsat data available as early as like 1974, mid to early 70s, I think. But it's just not compatible with data from 85 onwards, and that's a difficult nut to crack. I will leave it to the software engineers at Arrows to figure that one out. And then with regard to the SFIM data, yes, I have asked the BLM about that. It's been a hard task to get a hold of it. I don't know if you guys have a copy of those data. If you do, we would be interested in it.
I see Jonathan shaking his head. Yes, he has that. I have a question. Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Okay. So for doing allotment level rangeland health assessments, I seem to recall you saying that it was not appropriate to use your data as part of the RAP, and that might have been at the 30-meter resolution. But I'm wondering now with this newer high resolution version from 2023, maybe onward, does it become more appropriate?
Okay, so to be clear, we've got the new generation of data, the accuracy is 30 meters, the same as the old version. And maybe I was somewhat confusing in my description of our high resolution training data, which is at 2 meter resolution. But so the point is that both data sets are 30 meters, and we will continue doing 30-meter resolution for the conceivable future as well. Just the consistency of the Landsat archive can't be beat, and it's it's a good resolution. I've had people want finer resolution before. It's just a challenge to do this temporal and spatial scale with anything finer than that.
And can you speak to the appropriateness for the
Yes, right,
health assessments at the allotment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, related to what I spoke to before, I think my my viewpoints on this have shifted a little bit. So I've been in contact with Sarah McCord. She is the head of the RAP project, and the folks who do Landcart as well. In fact, BLM hosted a summit between all three of our projects and some BLM folks last fall, which is really great to get everyone in the same room together. I mean, we produce similar sorts of data, and that was a major topic: is the appropriate spatial scale to use the data. So my guidance on that is fluid, unfortunately, as we're learning more and thinking about how to communicate with this better to users. I would say I would definitely think it is appropriate to use our data at an allotment scale. I think that is certainly within the realm of feasibility. When we do our independent validation, which I'll talk about later if I have time, we're validating the accuracy of our products at individual pixels. So those accuracy numbers are reflective of you picking a single pixel at random on the landscape and seeing how accurate it is. So that's the bar that we're holding our data against. Do I think it's wise to look at single pixels? Not necessarily, but the sort of pasture allotment scale, I have no reservations in using our data or RAP for that matter at that sort of scale.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry for that convoluted answer. Okay, so what do we got? 17 minutes left here. I think, oh, I better go into high gear here. It's just a case study of how the data look with regard to a juniper treatment that the BLM did in Nevada. I mean, we can clearly see the impact of that treatment on declining tree cover, increasing sage cover over the footprint of that treatment. This is another interesting example over in Wyoming, an abandoned uranium mine, showing how the landscape has changed since the abandonment of that mine, increasing or decreasing rather bare ground, increasing herbaceous. So showing the seeming success of revegetation efforts in that area. There's all sorts of things you can do with the data. I wish I had more time to play around with it more. One thing we've looked at is the regrowth rates of shrubs following fire and seeing how that varies by ecoregion. So, for example, there are certain ecoregions that following fire, we see a rapid increase in shrub cover. So, implying that that ecosystem can recover following disturbance, like the Sierra Nevada, for instance. Shrubs do quite well following fire. But in other ecoregions, like the Central Basin and Range, far drier, shrubs take forever to recover, and even 30 years after the fire, have not yet, on average, returned to where they were before fire. And perhaps they never will now that they've been invaded by cheatgrass. So a lot of this is driven by precipitation. Wetter ecoregions recover more quickly than drier ones do. For the sake of time, I'll skip over some of this stuff. I'll talk about validation quickly. The take home here in terms of validation is about 15% improved accuracy relative to our old version. So fairly significant, especially with shrub and herbaceous cover, more accurate. I wish we could get higher accuracy still. This is what keeps me up at night, is thinking about what we can do to modify the models, add additional training data, more variables, etc., to improve model accuracy. Tree cover, bare ground, and herbaceous are by far the most accurate components. So these are some of the R squared numbers. We're in the 0.6, 0.7s. In terms of, this is independent validation. So again, these are picking single pixels out of the landscape where we collected field data and corresponding our predictions against those locations. We've got about 3,000 points in these correlations that I'm showing here. So definitely, as always, room for improvement, but are moving the right direction. I'll skip over this stuff for the sake of time, and this as well. I want to allow time for questions. So moving forward, we're going to investigate some other sources of data besides Landsat. So, for example, the synthetic aperture radar data from Sentinel, which is a European Space Agency satellite. And then we've done some work with hyperspectral data. For example, from this EMIT sensor, which is on the International Space Station. So the SAR data is advantageous, and then in that you can see through clouds, A, and B, that it gives you an idea of the height of the vegetation. And both of those things can be helpful to classification. The EMIT data, the hyperspectral data, is useful in seeing a greater breadth of the electromagnetic spectrum. So Landsat looks across the whole range of that EM spectrum from red to infrared, and divides that only into 8 unique buckets, versus this EMIT sensor divides it into, 285. So it basically allows you to see with more fidelity how the vegetation or the surface is reflecting light. We've done some testing with both of these, and initial tests are showing like a 30% improvement in accuracy, so pretty significant. The downside is we lose the time series with these new sensors. We only have data from, say, 2016 onwards using these new sets of data. So there's always trade-offs. You can improve accuracy, but then you lose the time series. And there's been discussion of possibly making a parallel time series using some of these new data sets, but that remains to be seen. Yeah, so here's an example of that hyperspectral work I mentioned. What you should focus on is, so the wavelengths here, we're talking about what spectrum of light we're seeing. The dots represent sort of what Landsat is seeing, and the lines are representing what this new EMIT sensor is seeing. The point being that there are some areas that are critical to separating among vegetation targets that are just missing from Landsat. And then adding this additional spectral data gives us a pretty significant increase in accuracy. I talked about the spatial scaling stuff. There's more work that needs to be done there. I'm currently leading some analysis looking at this at a broader scale, and then also looking at ecoregion variation and bias. So, for example, maybe there's certain ecoregions where we consistently overpredict shrub cover or underpredict bare ground or whatever. To make users aware of these sort of biases at a relatively systematic level and account for that in their analyses. The spatial scale thing, my best guidance I can have at this point, just to reiterate, is the bigger the area, the better. But it doesn't need to be a whole state. It doesn't need to be a whole county. A pasture is good enough. Single pixels I would be wary of, but 90 meters is better than 30 meters. Any other questions on that? Otherwise, we only have 9 minutes left here. I was going to quickly transition to the question that one of your group had on this. Was it Robber's Roost allotment?
Yeah, it's a nice place.
It looks like a beautiful place. Does this look like that allotment to you?
Yep, that's right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Sorry,
So
I was on mute.
What particular attribute were you curious about, and just how things have changed through time, or what in particular are you curious about in terms of this allotment?
Well, I just find it interesting. I've spent a lot of time, collected a lot of data on it, and know the veg types, and they're fairly uniform in the different sort of areas. So like in the areas going down towards the canyons on the left side on the west, there are there's a long strip from north to south. I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 miles wide. That is black brush ESD, and virtually 100% of it is in black brush bare ground state. So like we were getting like less than a pound per acre, mostly zeros, but like in the extremely low single digits of grass production in that whole large area.
Okay.
And when I go into the perennial grass scene, and I like it's difficult with sharing screen to actually do it, but most of that stuff was showing up as fairly significant levels, significant for this kind of system.
Sure.
Significant levels of perennial grass. So I think we were 5 to 15% kind of situation.
So I'm looking at that now. This is our new herbaceous layer for 2023, by the way. I clicked in a random pixel over here at 3%. I mean, it looks like there's a couple areas that might be a touch higher than that, 3. But generally fairly low. I don't know if my Arc Pro session is keeping up on sharing screen or not.
Yeah, it's
but
beautiful.
It does look like there's some riparian areas that show up as a bit higher herbaceous cover. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, go a little further east, because like where you're pointing is mostly slick rock.
Okay, so like this sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. You got it.
Okay, so we're at 9% cover there.
Yeah, and I've done plot. Like I of course don't have the plots up there, but like if you're getting, like 1/10 of 1%, that is like, wow, there's some grass out there. And so basically, if you take that whole strip, like before, and you can sort of see the general outline, from the canyon areas, and then to the east, all that's a big strip of black brush bare ground. And then if you move farther to the east, you get into this situation, and the similarities in the ESDs are striking. So, like there's only a few ESDs for the whole area.
Mhm.
And so the other category, slightly higher elevation, you get into what should be dominated by forewing and needle and thread. And both of those species have been grazed out of the system. And so your primary shrub component is gone. And all you're left with, is essentially Guyetta and Mormon tea. And so, like you've completely lost major components out of your system. And it's and also on the grass front, like all these sites were producing somewhere in the range of, like a really good situation would be, say, 15% of potential on grass.
Okay. Yeah.
And
I mean,
and in terms of pounds per acre, like definitely higher than the black brush, but still, really, really low. And when I clicked on a few pixels, like it was showing way, way, way over, like what the on the ground data was
do you,
was.
do you recall if that's with this new generation of data, or maybe the better question is, when did you look at this?
Oh, it was like this morning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, that's unfortunate. I mean, there's going to be errors. One important error to remember is models have a propensity to regress towards the mean, and our model is no different. I We try everything we can to avoid that tendency, but what we see fairly consistently is that there will be some level of inflation of values at the low end, which, what you're saying doesn't surprise me. If you're expecting 0 or 1% herbaceous and you actually see 7 or 9, that level of discrepancy is not terribly surprising to me. And then the same thing at the high end. If you're expecting to see 90% herbaceous cover or 100% bare ground cover, to have somewhat lower values than that in the products is not surprising. Sort of inflating the low end, deflating the high end of the distributions, and all the products would suffer from the same kind of tendency.
And just one other question. I deal a lot with ESDs, and so the question, for many of the categories, is comparison to ecological potential.
Mm-hmm.
Where does ecological potential in this universe come from?
Okay, so our ecological potential layer, I didn't speak about that. We produced those a couple years ago. What those are driven by is screening through all our training data, finding sites with relatively low annual herbaceous cover, relatively low bare ground cover, and then looking through the entire Landsat archive to find sort of the best case scenario in terms of vegetation greenness um, across time, and then building out a model with those training data and Landsat composites. So what that gives you is sort of the modern, if you will, best case scenario in terms of vegetation cover. Is that the same thing as site potential? No, it's not. Um, Clearly there was disturbances on the landscape way before 1985. But in general, ecological condition was probably on average maybe somewhat better, at least in terms of annual herbaceous. It was better in 85 than now. So that's
And
that's sort of the premise of our ecological potential. And if you have more detailed questions, I'm happy to follow up on that.
yeah, and like in terms of a data set, you're familiar with ESI from BLM?
I'm afraid I'm not.
Oh, okay. Ecological site inventory. It's, like, as with much data in the BLM side, there's a paucity of it, but it was the primary focus, sort of after the SVIM era, going up to fairly recently. And so there is depending on the area, there is significant levels of ESI data. And basically this gives, quantitatively through clipping, gives you a similarity index, of what's out there, compared to the HCPC for the ESD. And like we use it, but BLM has a significant set of data, on it, as well. And I of course FOIA this kind of material, and read through it for the areas I cover, which is essentially Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. And in general, I'm generalizing here, but it's pretty rare, to see, any ESI data that is much over 70% of potential, and probably the majority of it is in the 50% range,
Sure.
with like drier areas, being like even further, like, I've got a whole bunch from Salt Lake field office that's in the 5 to 20% of potential range.
So that doesn't surprise me. I mean, it sounds like what you're seeing is patterns in ecosystem resilience and resistance. Um, and yeah, I mean, what is the old adage with grazing? Take half, leave half, kind of thing. So to see 50% of potential might not be surprising given that guidance.
Yeah, and it would be, like, that 50% comes from the long-term changes in the plant community from the
Right.
removal of, the grazing sensitive species, things like that. So where I get concerned, is, like the BLM, using this data to say, oh yeah, look, it's only slightly departed from, from potential, therefore it meets rangeland health standards, and we're good to go. Um, that's the kind of sort of rubber meets the road kind of situation that definitely concerns me with, agency use of this data, to save their time going out into the field and actually collecting data.
I agree. Their data like ours or RAP or any sort of remote sensing product needs to be considered and used carefully. Um, it's it's unique in its ability to see through space and time. Clearly, we don't have that with field data. Field data is rather limited too in a lot of cases. So there's definitely trade-offs that need to be thought about. I mean, using multiple lines of evidence is always good practice. Um, we I mentioned the discussions we've had with the RAP project and land card project. We've talked about making sort of a consensus product among all three of ours that would sort of take the average for, or some sort of weighted average among all three products to sort of hopefully have the best of all worlds. That is still a discussion that's ongoing at this moment, but there's potential there. I mean, I would always look at your field data if you've got field data in your area. Um, that that's definitely important, an important line of evidence to consider as well. I don't see this remote sensing work as replacing field data. I think that's short-sighted, but I think that they can complement each other for sure.
Yeah, just to sort of let you know how the BLM is using it at this point, I'm, just dealing with a decision where, essentially this is the only data, like, that they based the decision on,
Yeah,
on this.
yeah, I yeah, I don't know if that's maybe not the best decision, but um, more lines of evidence always good. There's
Yeah.
error in our products. I mean, there's error in field data to be honest too. Uh, I was at SRM earlier this year, and I listened to a presentation on AIM data. Someone had tagged along with an AIM crew for a summer and was observing, the consistency of measurements, and there's issues there as well. I'll just say that it's not 100% perfect, and our data certainly is not either. There is error in our data. I'm very well aware of error in our data, but I think using specific values as like thresholds can get you into trouble. I like to look at more relative patterns, spatial patterns, sort of the context and the trend, to me, is more meaningful than a specific value.
And like on the BLM front, this could be taken care of with a properly worded IM. Given the increasing importance, of remote sensing, materials, having, some kind of IM going out, in terms of appropriate and inappropriate uses, would be good.
So we are drafting something like that currently. So hopefully that's out within the next year. I think a lot of users have been asking for something like that, the sort of appropriate uses of these sorts of data. Dealing with the spatial scale question that was posed earlier, patterns of bias, how these data could be used in decision-making frameworks, etc. Just giving more formalized guidance on all of these things. That being said, it is hard as a data user to police all of the uses of data, right? We produce the data, we try to give appropriate guidance, but it's ultimately, the use of the data is not controlled by us. But I'm afraid I have to go now. I'm being summoned into another meeting. So nice to talk with all of you, and please do follow up with me if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to address it and have one-on-one calls with any of you if interested.
Thanks, Matthew. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you,
you.
Matthew. That was great. I'll make sure everyone
you.
has your contact info.
Okay, sounds great. Bye.
Bye.